Okay guys, so now we're going to start on a new chapter. Okay, we're going to start on World War II in Europe. And as usual, before we begin, make sure you have your notes. I have uploaded a soft copy. Make sure you have your writing materials, you are comfortable, you are ready, the sun is shining, or whether it's raining. Make sure you have enough sleep, okay? If you don't have all this, stop and go and get rested before we start on any actual material so that you actually retain something. Okay, so we're gonna look at this now, the outbreak of World War II in Europe. It's chapter 4.1. Okay, remember we are looking at Europe. Europe is a continent, it is not a country. And we are looking at outbreak, we are looking at the start of the war. So what led to the start of the war? Okay, so in the sense when we are talking about cause and effect, the outbreak of World War II is the effect. We want to be able to identify the cause. So for this video, I'm just going to take you through a brief overview of what World War II is, some background context before we dive into the chapter itself. Okay, so what is World War II? We know that World War I was fought. Okay, World War I was fought from 1914 to 1918, and when it was fought, they say it was a war to end all wars, but 20 years later, we have World War II, which was even bigger. Okay, it's called World War II obviously because it is global scale. And between 1939 to 1945, these are dates you must memorize. Okay, later I'm going to go through a timeline. Now, there are two primary theaters of war. What is a theater of war? A theater of war is the space in which the conflict is fought. And usually we think of them in geographical terms. So we are looking primarily at Europe as well as Asia Pacific. Europe is chapter 4.1 and 5.1. 4.1 being the start of the war, 5.1 being the end. Asia Pacific, we will look at it 6.1 and 7.1. Here then we'll be talking about Japan. Thus far, World War II is the largest military conflict that we have ever seen. Let us pray and hope that that does not change. And the effects of World War II can still be felt today. I mean, next year when we go into Sec 4, you'll see that World War II does affect the Cold War. In fact, it is responsible for the position of the USA in the world today as the leading superpower. Okay, so now the question is, who is involved? Now let me split it into two. First, we have the Axis, and then we have the Allies, who normally we put them in blue. Now, who is on the side of the Allies? At first, when the war breaks out, it is Britain and France. Okay, and they are fighting against Germany. So we call them the Axis powers because it's not just Germany. It's Germany and Italy. Okay, this is in 1939. At first, the Soviet Union is allied with Germany. They have this thing called the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. But what happens is that Germany betrays it, and in 1939? Sorry, no. Late 1940, Germany launches this thing called Operation Barbarossa, which is the invasion of the USSR, and thus the USSR enters the war on the side of the Allies. Okay, after that, Japan gets itchy. They see World War II happening in Europe, and they decide that the colonial powers aren't going to retaliate in Asia, or rather to a lesser extent. So Japan, it jumps into the war. Who do they attack? They attack Pearl Harbor, which is when the USA jumps into the war for good, and that is in 1941. So this, ladies and gentlemen, basically sums up the major powers of of note. Okay, you must look at Germany and Japan as well as the USA. For this chapter, the USA is the most important country to study, even though we will look at other countries as well. Okay. In terms of the timeline of the war, let us go through a broad overview. Oh dear, that is a terrible color. Erase. Let's pick a better color. Okay, so this is I am terribly sorry. This is the timeline of the war. Let's just use purple. Okay, so here in 1945, okay, in 1939, okay, 1st September 1939, what happens is that Hitler starts to attack. Okay, Hitler launches an attack. His tanks roll into Poland. Okay, and then Britain and France declare war on Germany. Okay, so what happens later on in by middle of 1940, okay, Germany has basically swept across the whole of Europe, and all of continental Europe is dominated by the Nazis. They also launch an attack on the USSR. Okay, and they are quite successful all the way up to maybe the end of the winter of 1940. In 1941, in fact, what happens is that on 7 December, we have the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then the Americans retaliate. The Americans join into the war on the side of the Allies. Okay. After that, what happens? Another important turning point is in 1943. This is when the Soviet counterattack happens. Okay. In 1944, what happens is that on 6th of June 1944, the Allies launch D-Day. So if you have ever watched this show called Band of Brothers, okay, go and watch it. Yes, go and watch it. It is the Allied counter-invasion of Germany, and in 1945, that is when World War II ends. Okay, in April and in September. April is the Nazi surrender, September is the Japanese surrender, and that's when World War II ends. Okay, but for this chapter, we want to explore what led to this point, what led to World War II breaking out, what is the action that resulted in Hitler actually daring to start the war. Okay, so this is the question that we are looking at. What is the reason for the outbreak of World War II in Europe? Okay, now basic content. It is the German invasion of Poland. This is what started the war. Okay, 1st September 1939. And then Britain and France declare war on 3rd September 1939. Now, if you cannot remember, just remember that the outbreak of war happened in September 1939, and it was triggered by the German invasion of Poland. Okay, so the question, of course, is why did this happen? Because the questions that will be going on in my head is, didn't the Treaty of Versailles affect Germany? Did they have to demilitarize? You know, how did Germany even get to power? You know, I thought they were not allowed to have certain numbers of planes and things like that, that they had limits on their treaty. Wasn't their economy in shambles? Okay, how are they in this position of strength which they're actually able to launch a war? And doesn't the League of Nations exist? Doesn't the League of Nations have an obligation to stop Germany? Okay, so we need to figure all these things out. Okay, and as usual, we have the pyramid of causation. Okay, we have the underlying circumstances. So we have underlying here. I want to know what is the trigger, and I also want to know what are the contributing factors, what else built on the underlying factors and caused World War II to break out. That is what we want to look at. Okay, so we always want to look at cause and effect. And these are the three big reasons which we have to look at. Okay, the weakness of the League of Nations. Why? What is the League of Nations supposed to do? We are supposed to have this thing called collective security, right? And we are supposed to prevent conflict. So because the League was weak, that is why they could not stop Germany from launching an attack. And we also have Hitler's expansionist policy. So this is in essence, it is German aggression. Okay, expansionist, as you can imagine, is to do with this idea of getting bigger and becoming more powerful. But in those days, when we are looking at expansionist policy here, we are talking about territorial expansion, not cultural expansion. Okay, and here we have this very interesting thing called appeasement. Let me just say that it's going to be about Britain and France. When we were looking at the Treaty of Versailles and the impact of World War I, we already touched on this, but we are going to look at this in a little bit more detail for this chapter. Alright, so these are the three big reasons, and I would like you to think about it, okay, if we are going to categorize them into the pyramid of causation, which factor belongs where. Alright? Now, if you follow with me, on your notes, you will have this timeline. Okay, it's called the road to World War II, the road to when World War II breaks out. Yeah. So again, if you look at it, I have organized the key events into two categories. Now, the items on top of the line, all these are to do with German expansionism. What I mean is that all the events here point to German expansionist policy. Okay? Whereas the events underneath the line, they point to the weakness of the League, as well as appeasement. That is to say, things like Anschluss, okay, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Well, they are primarily a result of appeasement. Okay, this is just a simple way of categorizing them. Okay, obviously, if we look at an example of March 1936, yes, it is because of the weakness of League of Nations. That's how I categorized it. But it is also about Hitler's action. Okay, so later on, as we go through, I will explain the interaction between the two. So that is an overview of World War II. I have also put up a YouTube link, okay? It's a link to Crash Course World History, which is very informative. It gives you an even better background. It lets you know about things that I have not touched on yet, okay? So do have a look at it. It's only 13 minutes and it's very interesting. And it's in full color, unlike my black and white slides. Okay, it's time for the joke of the day. Do you know that actually I'm very afraid of taking the lift? So what did I do about my fear? Well, I've been taking steps to avoid it. Haha.